Hi, everyone. At the time that we're taping this, it's actually the end of May, and I know that a lot of teachers are starting to count down the days until the end of the school year and they go on summer vacation. But the sharp ones are also saying, wait a minute, how many calamity days do we have to make up, right? They're also taking that into consideration. Every school district goes through that. But what happens when those calamities are much bigger events, like a huge fire or an earthquake or a hurricane or a tornado? What do you do to prepare for that? That's not just counting days at the end of a calendar. It's really having an entire plan for rebuilding a sense of community in your school. That's the topic that we'll be talking about in this episode of Teaching Matters.
Welcome to Teaching Matters, a podcast exploring all things teaching and learning. Teaching Matters is produced by NPR affiliate WOUB Public Media in Athens, Ohio. And here is your host, Dr. Scott Tidsworth, Dean of the Scripps College of Communication at Ohio University.
Thank you so much, Trinity. My guest today is Dr. Megan Kuhfeld. She is the Director of Growth Modeling and Analytics at NWEA. NWEA is an organization that assists K-12 schools and districts in a variety of evidence-based and assessment objectives, in addition to providing research and advocacy on topics, a variety of topics, one of which is disaster recovery, which is why we asked Megan to be on today. Megan, it's nice to meet you, and I'm excited to talk to you about this.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
So I want to start, of course, your background is in education research, but because of the work that you do with NWEA, you've been involved in this topic, it looks like, for a while now as a research focus. You released a report, your organization, last year in 2025 that sort of started this conversation about what does it mean to be prepared, and it focused on the topic of the Katrina hurricane. Just to set the stage for the report being released this year, what were some of the things that you observed and, sort of synthesized in the report about Katrina?
Yeah, so we released that report around the 20-year anniversary of Katrina, which it's kind of hard to imagine, that it's been that long. But we really wanted to kind of understand what the long tail of recovery is from these big events. I think everyone pays attention really early on when there's a natural disaster, but what's often less known is kind of what happens after the fact. In terms of, especially big disasters, in terms of recovery, rebuilding, and how you get kids back in classrooms and back to normalcy, and something that was a huge life event in places like natural disasters like Katrina. There's often a before and an after, and the after is can look very different depending on the level of impact for the community. And so we were really hoping to understand who is most affected and kind of what that looks like in terms of academics, what it looks like in terms of kind of the mental health and social emotional, and then what schools can do to support the students as well as the teachers who have gone through this natural disaster.
As I look through the 2025 report, one of the sort of big headlines that I came out of that with is that this really shows that there is a potential blind spot for a lot of districts about especially these larger disasters. I also, when I read it, I started to think about the fact that, just thinking about the time that I've been in higher education, it feels like, these things have happened with some frequency, not always the same disaster, but there's always something going on related to natural phenomenon that impacts districts on a grand scale. This is well beyond the scope of your report, so you can punt on this question if you want to, but it does feel like there's more of these events that are impacting a wider array across the nation of schools. It's not just earthquakes in California and hurricanes in the Gulf Coast. It seems like these things are happening all over the place now.
Yeah, it really does. I mean, there are measures of the number of billion-dollar natural disasters that happen, and the number just keeps increasing every year. And, I think people often think about the examples you listed of earthquakes and wildfires and hurricanes, but we're talking about flooding in Hawaii now. We're talking about hurricanes impacting the mountains of North Carolina, huge Midwestern floods that can take out whole communities. So it does really seem like the number of districts that are facing these natural disasters has really grown. And it's hard to think of people who haven't been affected in some way between extreme heat, extreme, weather events, either themselves or family or friends.
Yeah, I mean, just in the Midwest right now, the number of schools have been impacted by tornadoes just this year, and
Yeah.
so, that's much more localized, obviously, but yet it happens, we have to be prepared for it everywhere. As you look at the national landscape, and I'm sure you've given at least some attention to this, even if it was beyond the scope of the data that you looked at, do you have a sense of sort of what the level of preparedness is across the nation in terms of districts being ready for these types of events? And I know the answer is it's varied, but do you have any sense of sort of, you know, where we're at right now?
Yeah, I mean, the answer is it's varied. It seems like a lot of times we kind of see the exemplars of districts that are doing well at preparing, and those are often in places where natural disasters are somewhat more regular.
Hmm.
So wildfires are, places where that's kind of a known risk. I think a lot of districts in the places that natural disasters have not been as common are pretty caught off guard a lot of the time when a major flooding event
Hmm.
happens, because they haven't necessarily had to build those kind of resources and planning time into their thing. And we know districts are facing lots of constraints right now. Many districts are facing budget constraints, thinking about closures of schools. So this kind of like tail risk event planning often has to come in a long line of things
Yeah.
that, district leaders are concerned about.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, as I look at the two reports where you're explicitly focusing on sort of weather related or at least natural phenomenon that would impact continuity of learning and operations of schools, of course, there are different scales of those. And so in Athens, where I live, about 8, 9 years ago, our high school was hit by a small tornado and didn't damage the school where they had to stop going, using the building, but it did take down some athletic facilities around the school. That's one scale. Obviously, in your reports, you're looking at bigger things like the hurricanes, Hurricane Harvey, Katrina, the wildfires in Colorado and California. Um, is there a planning for a disaster is planning for a disaster, but is there a different level of effort that goes into planning small scale impacts of weather versus these sort of community catastrophic levels?
Yeah, I think there is. I mean, I think in both situations, having a plan for how you want to communicate with families about the potential closures and having a plan for how you're going to try to make up days are like kind of essential, whether we're talking about a small disaster or a large disaster. But some of the bigger disasters events, like having to involve FEMA, having to
Hmm.
deal with family homelessness, building those community connections so that schools can serve as a recovery hub, those are really the types of things that school districts are worried about in the more larger disasters. And those are often the ones that it takes time and effort and is not necessarily on a district leader's playbook of things to focus on.
Right. In the 2025 report, you focus specifically on Hurricane Katrina, and then in the 26 report, and by the way, for listeners and viewers on YouTube, the link to the report, which is freely accessible, will be in the text accompanying the podcast, so you can take a look at this after listening to Megan and I. In the 2026 report, you expanded beyond Katrina to include the Camp Fire, to include Hurricane Harvey, the Colorado fire. I forget the name of it now. Are those all the case studies? Am I leaving one out?
The Marshall Fire is that
Yeah.
Colorado one. And I think we might have also, yep, those were the ones we mentioned, the Camp Fire, the Marshall Fire, and the Hurricane Harvey in Houston.
Right. So your process and your organization's process of doing research in this, can you just, in brief terms, talk about the process you went through to collect and then how, to collect data and then what you did to analyze the data and then distill the information into the report?
Yeah, so we kind of took two paths. One was to just read up the research that has been done kind of in your more traditional research publications. Often those are looking more at impacts on test scores or school operations. And then we also went out and looked for kind of case studies where people have done interviews with teachers and people on the ground, kind of in the immediate aftermath and often following up into later on, so that we could both kind of distill some of the information that came from these kind of quantitative, high-level analyses, as well as get some of the voices of the educators and the district leaders who had to deal with this directly. So we really wanted to kind of have both sides of the story. In addition to that, there's a lot of different kind of government and other organizations that have put out best recommendations for districts based on their own kind of data collection. So we were really trying to pull from a couple of different sources so that we could get a well-rounded kind of perspective on what's happening and not just be giving recommendations that are very unrealistic for the,
Right.
based on the opinions of folks who have lived through this.
Yeah. In the 26 report, the first lesson learned that is highlighted talks about the importance of pre-planning. In a general sense, what would you describe as being the important elements of having an adequate pre-plan for these not hypothetical, but not imminent events?
I think the first really step is understanding the risk factors for your community. You can't account for every possible, freak storm that will happen, but really knowing what are the biggest risks that you need to be planning for in order to make a plan around that. And there are kind of templates that exist that are called these emergency operations plans that you can download from organizations like FEMA and others. And so I think those provide a really thorough look at what it takes to build a good plan. And I would say just kind of two of the high level things that I see kind of again and again in these plans is communication and the importance of having really clear guidelines for who is in charge of communicating and what the means of communicating to within the staff of the organization or the district, as well as out to the families and to the community. The other clear thing that comes up in a lot of these is having partnerships, when possible, with other community organizations. Schools are often asked to do the impossible and to serve students, academic needs, social needs, emotional needs, mental health needs, and schools are not always resourced to do that. So that's where partnerships with kind of community organizations that may be serving mental health needs or that work with homelessness in the local area, building on those foundations so that schools know who to turn to in order to make sure the help can happen at the school and that the resources kind of flow through the school. Because schools are often the hubs of our community. They often are kind of the central point for families. They're often the evacuation point in places, even for families that don't have kids in that community. They may be a place where families end up. So just making those relationships first in order to be able to call on them when you need them.
One of the things that I found interesting when I was going through the report, there was a link to a site that had the FEMA risk index that you could search. So you could go, like for me, I went to the state of Ohio and searched up Athens City schools. What was informative about that, I wouldn't say that I was surprised. I was relieved that we're not at risk of a tsunami or coastal flooding. So we've got that going for us.
You can check those boxes on the no worry
don't
area.
Don't have to have that in the plan. But it was interesting to look at that and to be able to say, okay, there's obvious things you would question about why, two schools in essentially the same community would have different index, categories. But that aside, just going through the columns and saying, we do need to think about wildfires, even though we're in southern Ohio. Mm-hmm. We have a major national forest next to us that rarely has large fires, not like you would see like the ones you mentioned in Colorado and California, but never's not always never, right? And so you see those and you think, okay, I need to think more carefully about it. I don't just need to think about snowstorms and river flooding, which we do get frequently here. I do need to think about some of these other events. I found that informative. Before we leave this topic, the topic of communication is one, because of my background that, of course, I'm oriented to. Mm-hmm. When you were interviewing folks, did you find that there were certain communication plans that seemed more mature? So in other words, they knew exactly how they were going to communicate information to students, families, and other stakeholders. And the stakeholders knew that. In other words, there was a circle that was connected where it really worked well. And how did they do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we saw was that making sure that there are multiple forms of communication in case certain, most districts have some sort of text alert
Hmm.
system or something that goes like that, that works like that. But in cases where power may be out, those systems may not work. So trying to build in your kind of core that the families expect, but then having other backup plans, I think,
Hmm.
is a really important piece, whether that's kind of phone chains or literally printing out information and putting it up at the school or things like that. Just having, I think, clear defined roles of who's in charge of it, and then having contingency plans for when internet is out, when phone lines are out, those kind of more extreme situations.
Yeah, and thank you for that. And I would just add that, and I'm sure you ran across examples of this. That when you think about the communication plan issue, it's the channels that you just described, and multiple is always better so that you have
Mm-hmm.
redundancy. I think also knowing that depending upon the event and whether you can anticipate it,
Mm-hmm.
understanding that you need to have for lack of a better term, a calendar or a timing for the
Exactly.
cadence of your communication. Just as a very brief local example, we find it very comforting when either my university or the local school district says, we know that there's a major snowstorm coming in 2 days. Here are the steps we're going to take to have contingency plans in place for whatever happens. That
Mm-hmm.
those sorts of messages before the event and then leading up to it, I think are really important. And and that's the type of thing that may get overlooked. If
Yeah.
you're actually doing an emergency operation plan, about that idea of when do you start communicating about the potential or known crisis that is coming.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, and I
um,
think more
go ahead.
often is just more often is often better, and
Yeah,
in the absence of information, people have a tendency to be extra anxious. So,
yeah, yeah.
over communicating, I think, is typically better than under communicating.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Turning back to a topic that you brought up, but I want to dig into it a little bit more. You mentioned that that schools often serve as hubs for a community, and let's dig in and talk a little bit more about what that could actually mean. I mean, you're right that sometimes, in fact, oftentimes, schools, because of the way that they're built, are great places for local officials to say this is a mustering spot, or
Mm-hmm.
this is a place if your home is damaged, you can go there for services. What are some other ways that districts should think about the way that they might become a focal point for service that goes well beyond education because of this community hub, concept?
Yeah, so one example is that, and we actually saw this in COVID too. Us, schools provide lunches and meals to families, and when schools shut down, and for some families, that means the kids are not getting breakfast and lunch. And so, finding ways to provide meal services, sometimes
Hmm.
being places for community donations, so people can donate clothes or objects for families that have lost, potentially everything in the natural disaster, are two examples of where schools often are asked, but sometimes are not staffed to be able to serve that role well. Another one is kind of screening for mental health issues or for trauma for these large natural disasters. Families may not have the ability to go out and search for kind of mental health support for their children. But if schools can be served as kind of the place where that screening happens, and even better, where those services can happen by bringing in people from the community to help provide extra support, that's another place where I think schools, it's kind of beyond what's typically tasked within schools,
Hmm.
but is another place that without happening in the school, it may not happen.
This may or may not be something that you uncovered, in your discussions and analysis of data. One of the implications of that could be that school staff, including both teachers and other members of the school internal stakeholder group, they might be asked to do things as not what their job is. So
Mm-hmm.
so if you're the principal of a school and your school becomes one of these community hubs, you're serving needs that go well beyond an academic administrator at that point. And it might also be the case that your staff is there just to help keep things organized, and
Mm-hmm.
all of a sudden are providing support for families and other individuals that has nothing to do with education. How do you, how do you prepare for that, like with your staff?
I mean, I think it's hard. It's something that I think having, if you can have point people who are kind of trained to be able to help coordinate some of those things, it's really helpful. But this is one of the things that came up over and over again was a kind of burnout of staff and educators because they're trying to be therapists, they're trying to
Yeah.
be educators. They might also be helping organize food drives and clothing drives. And typically, educators are members of the community, so they may
Yeah.
be dealing with their own, needs for rebuilding or having to deal with insurance and all these different things. So, to the degree possible, providing support and kind of acknowledgement that staff are being asked for a lot. But there's no kind of perfect answer to that question
Yeah.
because I think the reality is that it's a lot and making, we recommend that people makes time for educators who are dealing with their own kind of personal challenges post disaster, make sure that they have flexible time to be able to take care of themselves as well. But burnout seems to be a pretty common concern in these types of communities
Yeah.
after natural disasters.
Yeah, absolutely. Turning attention a little bit now to sort of so what we've been talking about as it's laid out in the report are sort of the things that happen before the crisis and then, planning your way into that. And what's happening during and immediately after the crisis. When you start to think about the transition out of the crisis, the immediate events over, one of the things that you all point out in the report is that you have to focus on what you refer to as first order needs before you can start thinking about the academic continuity, the continuity of learning. Can you talk about, what first order need, what you mean by that? And, I think the answer is going to be obvious to the listeners, but why do you have to solve that problem before you can get back to the lesson plan?
Yeah, so when we talk about first order needs, we really are talking about kind of building routines, building safe places for kids to gather and start to process what they have been through, especially in the context of these larger natural disasters. So we kind of think and have heard from the educators who were interviewed after these big natural disasters that kids are not going to be ready to learn until they can kind of feel safe and normal again. And sometimes that's a short process, sometimes that's a very long process. And so the recommendations that we heard were kind of setting up routines, building times to kind of process without just returning straight back into kind of lessons and academics, and making spaces for kids to share without requiring that they share because, kids process things differently. And it might be through sharing, it might be through art, it might be through other things that kids can get kind of closer to normal. But really building in time for that and building time for kids to kind of feel like there's a stable environment before returning to academics. That being said, we also know that teachers are getting pushed like, oh, you had 3 weeks off, so we have
Yeah.
3 weeks less to build, do everything that's in our standard set that we're supposed to be teaching in a year. So that push and pull of wanting to make spaces for the social, emotional, mental health side and make space for academics is really hard. And so one of the things that we also heard from teachers was that getting help deciding what are the core pieces that need to be covered in terms of the academics and kind of what maybe is secondary so that they can be a little bit more targeted in, trying to squeeze an entire year's curriculum into however much time was really valuable, and getting kind of some just reprieve from the standard accountability expectations was also really helpful in order to build that balance between the two kind of components.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, all of these events are different than COVID and vice versa in a lot of ways. But and during COVID, many schools, many universities, went through a period of time where students had much more flexibility in changing course grading to just be pass fail and things like that. I think we learned a lot of lessons from that wasn't wrong, and yet at the same time it had its own effects that were
Yeah.
unintended. And I think that's tricky, but you have to take all that into consideration. You can't just flip a switch and say, well, we're back to normal now, which raises the question, as you went through these case studies where these communities were so impacted and continue to be impacted by these events, we like to say they will eventually get back to normal, but for these communities and the students that went and experienced these, what does normal look like once you work through the tail end of that process after the event?
Yeah, I mean, I think it can look very different. I think for some communities, normal was when the school was rebuilt. So it was a multi-year process of, the getting kids back into a school that was new. They weren't sharing a building with someone else.
Hmm.
For other places, normal meant just that the classroom is together again, and maybe they're in a makeshift classroom in a non-school building until the school could reopen, but the kids and the teacher were back together, and that kind of space helped bring normalcy, that kids were able to learn again. So it does kind of vary, I think,
Yeah.
both depending on the circumstances and depending on the child. But we did see over and over again that for some communities, especially the ones hit extremely hard by hurricanes and wildfires, normal was a multi-year affair,
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
a couple-month affair. And that places like the Camp Fire in California, many people were displaced, or same with Hurricane Katrina. And so it never really felt normal again because half of the community left and didn't come back.
Yeah.
So, I think the normalcy range can be very short term, or it could be the new normal. And then kind of like true normal can be sometimes years or decades. It took them 18 years to rebuild all the schools after Hurricane Katrina. So, we're 20 years out from Hurricane Katrina, and they finished building schools 18 years out. So it's a very long
Yeah.
tail.
Yeah, interesting. Turning attention now back to the more central academic question, you all advocate a phrase that you refer to as multi-tiered supports, thinking about more the long-term recovery. What do you mean by multi-tiered supports? What does that look like?
Yeah, so basically what we advocate for, and this is a system that many schools use, generally for supports, not just in this context of natural disaster, but really making sure you kind of have a level of universal supports for students. So kind of safe and supportive environments, and training staff to be able to recognize and screen for maybe kind of trauma or mental health challenges. And then, multi-tiered supports is often shown as a triangle. So that's the base is universal, and then you get more targeted depending on the needs. So for students with really elevated levels of trauma, maybe making sure that they get additional supports outside of the classroom with a school counselor or some sort of community mental health system. And then really just kind of tailoring the needs depending on the supports depending on the needs of the student.
Yeah, I appreciate the way you describe that because oftentimes, when I think about that phrase, I think about students who are, in some ways defined as being in a risk category that needs those supports. And I think maybe what I hear you saying in your report saying is that the environment can put students at risk that weren't at risk before that event.
Exactly.
And that you have to adapt to that. Two specific questions that I think is interesting. One question relates to the issue of calendaring. And so we know that by state law, school districts have to, and it varies from state to state about the details of it, but they either are accountable for a number of teaching days or hours, depending upon the state and how they define and operationalize that. Did you see evidence of, where schools had to, maybe gain permission from state boards of education or systems like that to alter their calendar because of such a significant disruption?
Yeah, so we did see some examples of districts petitioning to the state to kind of get out of the state mandated instructional time because, let's say they missed 3 weeks due to flooding, the school would be going to mid-July, if
Yeah.
you were going to try to have to make up all those days. So that was something that was fairly common. Some states also have policies where you could kind of like waive a certain number, like they build an instructional calendar that's
Yeah.
longer than the state mandated, and then you can waive a certain number of days. But that was a pretty common thing that like many school districts that are used to snow days or kind of just severe weather days build in extra snow makeup days or weather makeup days. But then these natural disasters usually push well past what kind of is can be accommodated within those systems.
I think my second more specific question actually relates back to the previous question on multi-tiered support. But I noticed in your personal research background that you've done work looking at, for example, how summer programming can be used in situations like you studied COVID, but I think it would apply to situations like this too. Can you just kind of go off on your own little research interests and talk about how those sorts of programs for extended opportunities for students can be effective in sort of recalibrating them, back maybe to their grade level, or at least getting closer to that?
Yeah, so I think summer learning programs are a really great place for that to help not that everyone who goes through a natural disaster needs to kind of get into a summer program to make up, but in order for the kids who have fallen really far behind, we have pretty strong evidence that summer programs can help, particularly in math, kids recover. I think the challenge is they take a lot of resources for districts to plan and operate well. And so the challenge is, of course, the districts that are struggling with recovering may also be struggling to plan something in addition, beyond just the standard school year. And that's another place where sometimes community resources can be kind of helpful to help get some of those systems in place. But I do think finding time outside, there's only so much we can do within a single school year that we can ask teachers and students to kind of like push above and beyond. So finding summer programs that are effective, I think, is a really great strategy for districts.
Yeah, absolutely. Megan, I think my last question, if you read the report and you're honest with yourself, you come away from that saying, well, we have an emergency action plan already, and so, but after reading this report, I should look at it again, right? I mean, it's like you read this and you're like, there's a lot of really good sort of, I don't want to call them check boxes. That's not what it is. But the report is comprehensive enough about the entire picture that I think it should cause any administrator, principal, et cetera, to say we should get the report, the emergency action plan back out and look at it. So having said that, that's the motivation that I think everyone should read your brief and then actually go through that process of looking at their emergency action plan. At the end result, the action plan needs to be created by a district. And, have you observed through the research that you've done, are there characteristics of these plans? And in some ways you've answered much of this, I would say, but are there characteristics of these plans that are consistently blind spots for districts? And the more mature ones, what do they look like relative to the less mature plans? Does that question make sense to you?
Yeah, it does. I think that one of the blind spots that we see is the educator need component. That, educators and school leaders are just asked to do more and more and more without necessarily thinking about how educators' own mental health, their own kind of personal needs play in. So that's one place that I think over and over again we saw that it was kind of easy to overlook because of the emphasis on supporting students and supporting the community. So I think that's one kind of important piece. In order for everything else to be successful, we also have to support the people who are doing the supporting. I think the other part that's not always overlooked, but kind of harder to do is just those strong community relationships and kind of maintaining those over time and having, I don't remember if I mentioned this, but one of the things that came up was having kind of a trauma resource team that drew on both kind of school counselors, district officials, and community members. And so that's something that we don't see in all these different districts, but something that has been found to be effective in terms of on the planning side, beyond just the school operation plan, can we plan for the kind of anticipated mental health and trauma sides of things too? And unfortunately, there's a lot of events in our country that beyond just the natural disasters where these types of trauma teams start to, become important. So I think that's another component that is just really valuable and not always part of the kind of just how do we get the lights back on, how do we get schools open component of the operation plans.
Yeah, I would say I would just add one thing that we do, and I know that a lot of universities and larger districts do, is tabletop exercises. And so it's one thing to have a plan, and even if people are cognizant of what is in that plan, if you don't actually, it's like anything, if you don't go through the practice, when game time actually gets there, you lose, and you lose knowledge of how to actually act. And at least in the state of Ohio, our Department of Public Safety actually is very helpful in helping large organizations, whether it's a university or a large district, or it could be a small district as well, understand how to sort of do those concepts well. And so that could, I'm sure, be a resource for others. But I can't understate the importance of that, because just at Ohio University, for example, we have a river that runs through town. Decades ago, the Corps of Engineers sort of tried to flood-proof the city from the river, and about, 9 years ago, there was at least 24 hours where they thought that the river was going to overtop the levees, which would have been significant. We still had students on campus, and because of the fact that we had a very matured, emergency plan, a committee, as you said, sort of a crisis response committee that met regularly. They had tabletop that exercise already, and so they knew exactly at what point they had to send students away from campus and tell them to go home, so that they wouldn't be stuck on campus and in Athens during a major flooding event. Things like that, you need practice on. So, hey, Megan, is there anything I haven't asked you about that you think is important to tell listeners about this topic?
I mean, I think just building off of what you last said, one of the things that really was clear to me is that this is a lot. This is a lot to ask of districts, but there's also a lot of support in terms of other districts that have gone through this, or kind of government resources, like organizational state government that focuses on, supporting districts or supporting mental health issues. So I think the number one thing I would say is don't try to go at it alone. Don't try to reinvent the wheel. Call on other folks who have expertise in emergency planning and really have them help you build a system, rather than try to figure out everything on your own, because it's a lot to plan for all these different contingencies.
Yeah. Hey, I told you before we started recording that I really enjoyed reading the report, because I thought it was very well done. And as I said, while we were recording, I think that anybody that reads this will say, I probably need to check on this element in our plan. So thank you for doing the research and making it available to the public. We really appreciate it. And it was great to meet you.
Yeah, thank you so much. That is the best compliment a researcher can get, I think, that the work is useful.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, everyone, for listening to Teaching Matters podcast. Special thanks to April Koska and Trinity Sweet for being associate producers of the podcast. If you have ideas, thoughts, comments, or suggestions, please feel free to reach out to us. Email is probably the easiest way. Just send it to teachingmatterspodcast@ohio.edu. That's all one word and all lowercase. We thank you for listening or tuning in on YouTube, and we hope that you have a great day.